The morning sun had not yet fully stirred Flaxborough when Mrs. Eunice Weatherby, chairwoman of the Horticultural Society, arrived at the town hall to inspect the arrangements for the annual spring flower show. The hall smelled faintly of dust, polished wood, and the lingering perfume of last week's council meeting, which Mr. Blenkinsop, the town clerk, insisted was a delicacy in its own right. As usual, Flaxborough awoke with a deliberateness peculiar to towns where nothing truly urgent ever happened. The grocer opened precisely at 8. The baker arranged his pies in strict geometrical order, and the postmistress, Miss Larkspur, fussed over her mail as though each letter were a miniature scandal waiting to erupt. It was in this atmosphere of careful normality that an unusual disturbance quietly announced itself. It began, as many oddities do, almost unnoticed. Room 12, the smallest of the exhibition spaces, and usually reserved for chrysanthemums and begonia arrangements, had been found slightly ajar. Miss Agatha Thorne, responsible for floral displays since her youth, discovered it upon her customary circuit. The room contained only a single exhibit, a neat pot of violets, ostensibly unremarkable. Yet someone, or something, had rearranged them, turning the blossoms inwards so that their faces seemed to whisper to one another in secret. Mrs. Weatherby tutted, drawing her knitted shawl tighter, as though the chill of the early hour had emboldened a cosmic affront to her sense of order. "How very extraordinary," she said to no one in particular, though several exhibitors nodded solemnly. "A most improper display." By the time Inspector Purbright arrived, called not by alarm but by polite necessity, room 12 had already accumulated a modest audience. Mr. Blenkinsop hovered near the doorway, muttering about insurance forms and liability clauses, while Mrs. Weatherby lectured a cluster of amateur florists on the dangers of lax security. Purbright, himself a man of quiet temperament and disarming patience, stepped inside with the careful manners of someone entering both a library and a confessional. He observed the violets for no more than a moment before noting the subtle misalignment of the petals, the barely perceptible fingerprints on the ceramic pot, and the slight scuff on the otherwise polished floor. Each was a small disturbance, insignificant in isolation, but together forming a curious pattern that he filed neatly away in his mind. "The violets. Rearranged, you say?" he murmured, voice soft and civil, more an invitation than an inquiry. "Yes, Inspector," Miss Thorne replied stiffly. "But who dare?" Purbright inclined his head. He made no promises, offered no theories, and, as usual, gave nothing away. In Flaxborough he had long learned that most people spoke with the full confidence of conviction, yet seldom with accuracy. Gossip, as he quietly noted, was always the first evidence, though rarely the final. Outside, in the fresh air of the square, the town began its slow murmur. Shopkeepers, street sweepers, and the occasional passing vicar speculated in whispers about the mischief in room 12. Mrs. Weatherby, decisive in her indignation, declared that the matter would require immediate attention, though exactly what kind of attention she could not yet specify. Meanwhile, Purbright lingered by the doorway, hands clasped behind his back, noting the way the morning light caught on the hall's wooden beams, and thinking, as he often did, that small disturbances had a way of revealing far more than great calamities ever could. It was, in short, the kind of incident Flaxborough pretended to ignore but secretly relished discussing over tea and scones. And in such a town, Purbright knew, the violets in room 12 were unlikely to remain merely a botanical curiosity for long. By mid-morning, the subtle disturbance in room 12 had achieved its intended effect. The entire town seemed to have acquired a personal stake in the affair, as if the rearrangement of a pot of violets had somehow undermined the very foundations of Flaxborough society. News travelled first by the reliable but exaggerated whispers of shop assistants, and then by the more official, but no less dramatic, pronouncements of Mrs. Weatherby. She moved from stall to stall in the town hall, recounting the incident with a gravity befitting a breach of national security. "I tell you," she said to Mr. Pendlebury, the gentleman who usually oversaw the arrangement of dahlias and occasionally smoked in discreet corners, "someone has tampered with room 12. Who can it be, I wonder? There must be an explanation, but one fears it is most unsatisfactory." Mr. Pendlebury, whose facial expressions were governed by a rigorous code of propriety, inclined his head and murmured something about careless youths, though he secretly suspected Mrs. Weatherby of exaggeration. He had long maintained that overstatement was a form of social lubrication, and today it appeared indispensable. Outside, the news began to seep into the marketplace, carried by the baker's niece and the grocer's apprentice, each adding a little flourish to the tale. Some spoke of mischief, some of sabotage, and a few, with alarming inventiveness, whispered of a curse that had fallen upon the violets themselves. "A whispering widow," one woman said, half in jest, half in fear. "Haunting room 12, no doubt." That particular turn of phrase was overheard by Mrs. Jenkins, who promptly related it to the postmistress, who in turn mentioned it to half a dozen regular correspondents who considered themselves arbiters of Flaxborough propriety. Inspector Purbright, having made his initial inspection, did not seek to interrupt the flow of gossip. He understood, as he always did, that the town often revealed its secrets more willingly when it believed he had no interest. Instead, he made his way quietly through the hall, noting each reaction, each slight quiver of the lips, each conscious avoidance of eye contact. The mannerisms of the townsfolk, he knew, were far more telling than any rushed confession or clumsy accusation. The florist, Miss Thorne, now surrounded by an eager audience, described the scene with meticulous detail. "The petals," she insisted, "are turned inward. One would almost think the flowers are conspiring among themselves." There was a pause, filled only by the faint rustle of newspapers and the occasional cough from an elderly onlooker. "I examined the soil," she added, "but there is no sign of tampering, nothing at all." Purbright, from his quiet vantage by the doorway, nodded once, almost imperceptibly. Soil untouched, petals adjusted, no footprints other than those already belonging to the exhibitors. It was, he reflected, exactly the sort of trivial yet pointed irregularity that demanded patient observation rather than hasty intervention. Meanwhile, the hall's other rooms continued their displays, and yet the attention remained fixed on room 12. Children craned their necks to peek, though they were quickly shooed away by vigilant parents. The tea urn simmered quietly in the corner, releasing its reassuring aroma of mild distraction. The effect was almost theatrical. Life continued, but under a new, slightly uneasy light. Outside, more characters emerged from their domestic routines, drawn by curiosity or a need to assert their opinions. Mr. Bartram, the retired schoolmaster, arrived clutching his walking stick and muttering about the decline of civility in public exhibitions. "One cannot leave anything to order these days," he said, voice low but carrying. "Chaos in the petals today, tomorrow anarchy in the council chamber. Mark my words." He did not pause to notice the ironic faint smile on the face of Mrs. Weatherby, who had herself contributed to the subtle turbulence with her dramatic recital of events. By the late morning, speculation had crystallized into what might be called preliminary theories. The names of a few possible culprits were whispered discreetly: the baker's apprentice, who had a reputation for clumsiness, a visiting gardener from a neighbouring town, perhaps even a member of the Horticultural Society who held a private grudge. Each suggestion was offered with carefully measured uncertainty, as if the speaker feared committing social suicide by being too confident. Purbright listened patiently to all of it. He noted Mr. Bartram's habitual exaggeration, Miss Thorne's precise and almost pedantic attention to detail, and Mrs. Weatherby's relentless enthusiasm for theatricality. He also observed subtle inconsistencies. The way one exhibitor glanced too quickly toward the hall door, the faint tremor in another's hand when asked if they had entered room 12, the brief but telling hesitation of a gentleman named Mr. Collingwood, who professed to be uninterested in flowers but had a habit of showing up at every meeting. The inspector allowed these impressions to settle into his mind without comment. There was no rush. Flaxborough had a way of revealing itself in increments, and Purbright, who had long ago learned the rhythm of its secrets, was content to follow the natural cadence. Small towns, he often reflected, operated like finely tuned machinery. A minor disruption would cause tremors far beyond its immediate vicinity, yet the outward calm remained intact, like a pond disturbed by a tossed pebble. Lunch approached with an unremarkable inevitability. Mrs. Weatherby insisted on convening a brief committee of observation, which consisted mainly of herself, Mr. Pendlebury, and 2 other exhibitors who had no objection to sitting in judgment while consuming scones and tea. They debated, with extraordinary seriousness, the moral implications of rearranged violets and the necessity of increased vigilance. Purbright, invited only in a civil sense, observed silently and sipped his tea, letting the other's fervour underscore the triviality and yet the subtle significance of the incident. A faint, almost imperceptible pattern began to emerge in Purbright's mind. Each person who mentioned room 12 framed the event not merely as a disruption of petals, but as a disruption of social expectation. There was, in every whispered opinion and measured judgment, a claim to understanding, an assertion of moral or aesthetic authority. And in that very assertion lay potential motives, though not yet articulated. By mid-afternoon, the town's attention had shifted temporarily to the railway buffet, where several exhibitors gathered to fortify themselves with tea sandwiches and mild indignation. Here the gossip ripened. Some suggested a practical joke, others a personal vendetta, and a few, with more imagination than sense, hinted at supernatural interference. Purbright, seated quietly at a corner table, made brief mental notes, the way Mr. Collingwood's eyes darted toward the hall with feigned disinterest, the subtle way Miss Thorne's fingers lingered on the handle of her purse, as if protecting more than mere coins, and the careful, almost defensive arrangement of Mrs. Weatherby's papers. The inspector allowed himself a small, private reflection. In Flaxborough, crimes were rarely violent. They were instead transgressions of expectation, breaches of propriety, or tests of patience and perception. In such an environment, the keen observer, quiet, polite, and patient, could unravel mysteries as complex as any involving theft or assault. By late afternoon, the evidence of disorder remained minimal. A turned petal, a displaced pot, and a town buzzing with conjecture. Yet, in the careful stillness of his office, Purbright began to chart the threads of interaction, noting patterns in human behaviour that hinted at rivalry, resentment, or simply the desire to assert oneself in a tightly knit community. Each person's statement, each glance, each unspoken tension was stored, not as accusation, but as quiet material for patient deduction. As dusk approached, the hall emptied, leaving room 12 under the watchful eye of a single custodian. The violets, illuminated by fading light, seemed once more innocuous, though Purbright could not help but notice the shadows in the corners of the room, the angles at which the petals caught the last rays of sun. There was, he reflected, a kind of subtle theatre in this quiet disturbance, a drama that only patience and observation could reveal. And in that reflection lay the understanding that the first stirrings of a mystery had, like the whispered rumours, only just begun to circulate. The morning following the flower show disturbance was characterized by the usual cautious ritual of Flaxborough life, though with an added undercurrent of curiosity. Shop windows displayed pastries and hardware with the same calm exactitude, yet behind each counter the conversation invariably returned to room 12. Inspector Purbright, arriving promptly yet unhurriedly at the town hall, noted that the air seemed charged not with urgency, but with the delicate tension of a society quietly policing its own proprieties. Purbright began his inquiries with Miss Thorne, who had recovered from her morning agitation, but remained highly alert. She greeted him with a precise nod, as if expecting both reassurance and scrutiny in equal measure. "Inspector," she said, her voice carrying the careful precision of a pianist striking the first chord of a familiar composition. "I'm afraid I have little more to offer than I did yesterday. The violets were alone when I found them. There were no footprints, no evidence of intrusion, nothing save their altered orientation." Purbright listened, eyes attentive, but expression neutral. "Did anyone else have access to room 12? He asked, voice courteous, almost conversational. Miss Thorne hesitated, glancing momentarily toward the doorway, then back. "The usual exhibitors, the committee members, I suppose. But each of us is bound by rules of conduct, Inspector. One would scarcely interfere, would one?" "Indeed," Purbright murmured, allowing the implied tension to settle. He made a note, careful and discreet, of the slight tremor in her fingers as she smoothed the edge of the tablecloth. Small gestures, he reflected, often spoke louder than words. Next, he called upon Mrs. Weatherby, who received him in the committee room with an air of triumph, as though she had already advanced half a step toward resolution. "Inspector, I thought it prudent you should hear my account directly," she said, motioning to the armchairs with a flourish that suggested ceremony more than necessity. "The impropriety, the audacity, why, it is most unsettling." Purbright seated himself politely, noting the precise way her shawl was draped, the meticulous stacking of papers, and the faint odour of lavender that suggested both cleanliness and intentional effect. "You mentioned yesterday that there were rules governing access," he said. "Is it possible someone overlooked them?" Mrs. Weatherby's eyes narrowed slightly, a reaction that betrayed neither confirmation nor denial. "I would not presume to suggest so, Inspector, yet one cannot ignore the fact that there are always those who act in defiance of propriety. It is a recurring theme in our otherwise decorous town." He allowed a pause, a gentle silence that prompted her to continue. "You understand, of course, that we maintain the highest standards. Reputation, decorum, respectability, all are at stake. That a simple pot of violets might be subject to such tampering is alarming indeed." Purbright made a mental note. The concern was not only for the flowers, but for social hierarchy. In Flaxborough, he knew, minor offences often concealed more complex manoeuvres of status. The next person he spoke to was Mr. Collingwood, whose presence at both the show and the railway buffet had been curious. Collingwood, a gentleman of orderly habits and studied politeness, received the inspector in his study, where he meticulously polished the brass fittings of a globe. "Inspector," he said, "I have no interest in horticultural pursuits, as you well know." "It is, I assure you, quite beneath my station." "Yet you were present at the exhibition," Purbright observed quietly, "and you have an intimate knowledge of the hall's layout." Collingwood adjusted his spectacles with the faintest hesitation. "One does make occasional observations, naturally. I am, as you say, acquainted with the premises, but I assure you I handled nothing and moved no object. My concerns are purely academic, well, intellectual perhaps, rather than horticultural." Purbright inclined his head, registering the subtle stiffness of the man's posture and the slight redness of his knuckles, which suggested an inner agitation not entirely aligned with his words. He stored these impressions carefully, knowing that the quietest anomalies often bore the richest significance. By midday, Purbright had also spoken to Mr. Bartram, the retired schoolmaster, and Mr. Pendlebury. Both men were fond of declaring that decorum had been violated in ways the town could scarcely tolerate. Bartram, whose pronouncements tended toward moral absolutism, insisted that any tampering with Room 12 was a symptom of broader societal decline. Pendlebury, more measured in tone, suggested that perhaps youthful mischief was at play, though the subtle twitch in his left eye betrayed a personal stake in the outcome that he would not yet articulate. At each interview, Purbright asked only the most civil and unassuming questions, allowing his interlocutors to reveal themselves voluntarily. He noted inconsistencies in phrasing, minute variations in gesture, and the selective emphasis each person placed on particular details. A hand hovering slightly too long over a teacup, a glance toward the doorway, a half smile, these were, in aggregate, the evidence upon which he would eventually rely. By late afternoon, the inspector had walked the hall once more, reviewing the positioning of every exhibit and the placement of each chair, table, and display. The subtle scuff on the floor by Room 12 remained a quiet anomaly, as did a faint fingerprint on the edge of the ceramic pot, scarcely perceptible yet lodged in memory. Purbright allowed himself the private satisfaction of knowing that the town, in its ordinary rhythm, had already begun to supply him with clues through its own compulsive need to comment, embellish, and theorize. As he stepped outside to breathe the cool, late afternoon air, he observed the marketplace slowly awakening to its own gossip. Shopkeepers exchanged glances over counters, children darted along cobbled streets, and the vicar, noticing the inspector, offered a courteous nod that masked the curiosity beneath. Flaxborough's routines were as predictable as the tide, yet the disturbance of Room 12 had introduced a subtle ripple, one that promised to extend beyond mere petals and vases. Purbright, with a quiet satisfaction born of experience, reflected that human behavior was the truest evidence. The flowers, though rearranged, were secondary. It was the pattern of reaction, the whispered conjecture, the carefully concealed nervousness, the polite assertion of moral or aesthetic authority that would, in time, reveal the heart of the matter. And Flaxborough, with all its self-conscious civility, was already beginning to show its true colours, if only one knew how to look. By evening the hall was empty once more, yet the town continued to murmur. Purbright returned to his modest office, where papers awaited attention, and the evening light fell in quiet rectangles upon his desk. He made a note of each observation, filing mental annotations with the patience of a man accustomed to slow revelation. Tomorrow, he knew, would demand careful follow-up, further inquiries, gentle prodding, and an unhurried confrontation with those whose behaviour deviated from expectation. For in Flaxborough, as always, the smallest anomaly could conceal the most revealing truths. By the following morning, the incident in Room 12 had begun to take on the character of inevitability. In Flaxborough, news that was initially startling often settled into the daily rhythm as if it had always been part of the town's narrative, yet it retained enough peculiar detail to spark endless conjecture. Inspector Purbright arrived at the town hall with quiet purpose, aware that the first responses, particularly those formed by gossip, often pointed less to truth than to prejudice and expectation. The first obvious suspect, the baker's apprentice, quickly emerged as a topic of polite discussion. He had been seen lingering near Room 12 during the previous day's exhibition, ostensibly checking the hall's cleanliness. Purbright, however, observed with his customary patience that lingering did not imply culpability. Nevertheless, the townsfolk delighted in weaving a neat story. A careless youth, prone to mischief, had dared to rearrange the violets, motivated either by boredom or the impulse for minor disruption. He summoned the boy, a wiry youth named Tommy Hargreaves, to the hall's committee room. The apprentice appeared anxious but polite, a mixture of guilt and confusion evident in his posture. "Inspector," he said, I only tidied the hall a bit. I didn't touch the flowers, honest, I swear." Purbright inclined his head, allowing the boy to continue, speaking without interruption. "I just swept the corners and checked for dust, that's all. I didn't even notice room 12 until Miss Thorne came running, waving her hands." The boy's voice faltered slightly at the mention of Miss Thorne, but he recovered quickly. "I wouldn't dare. She'd never forgive me." The inspector listened quietly, noting every nuance: the hesitation, the sudden tightening of the boy's jaw, the faint blush of embarrassment. These details, though subtle, formed a pattern that was not yet accusatory but demanded attention. When Purbright finally spoke, it was in measured tones, neither condemning nor excusing. "Thank you, Tommy. Your account is helpful. We shall need only your continued honesty." While the boy left, the town's speculation persisted. Mrs. Weatherby had already informed the press of the preliminary suspicion in the mildest terms, ensuring that the story would be reported with just enough drama to captivate her audience. By mid-morning, other members of the Horticultural Society had begun to take sides, some tacitly defending the youth, others hinting at further negligence in the hall's supervision. Purbright turned his attention to Mr. Collingwood, whose presence at the exhibition had been noted with some unease. Collingwood, despite his assertions of intellectual detachment, had a reputation for exacting standards and a subtle competitive streak in social matters. The inspector invited him for tea in the committee room, arranging a polite but deliberate examination of his movements and expressions. "You were present during the flower show," Purbright began, "and observed the arrangements in room 12. Did anything strike you as irregular?" Collingwood, polishing his spectacles, hesitated briefly before responding. "I confess, Inspector, that the arrangement seemed curious. Yet I am no gardener. Perhaps the violets were simply resting differently than yesterday." His hands, however, betrayed a faint tension, the grip on the teacup betraying a small but telling agitation. Purbright allowed the silence to stretch, encouraging the gentleman to fill it. Collingwood's next words revealed more than he intended. "It is disturbing to consider that someone within the society, someone with access and knowledge, might deliberately interfere. That would be most unbecoming." The inspector made a note of the subtle implication. The suspicion was cast not directly at the boy, but at peers within the society, including Collingwood himself, whose careful phrasing suggested awareness of social hierarchies and potential advantages. By late morning, Purbright had also interviewed Mr. Pendlebury and Mr. Bartram once more, cross-referencing the accounts with his observations. Each version of events contained slight variations, a glance here, a hesitation there, a selective recollection of who had entered room 12 at which moment. Such discrepancies were minor in themselves, but collectively suggested that someone, somewhere, was uncomfortable with scrutiny. Meanwhile, the town continued its ritual of observation and commentary. Street conversations turned to conjecture about motive. Was it mischief, ambition, or some obscure grievance? Did the rearrangement of petals signify a deeper social challenge, an assertion of taste or superiority? Purbright, as ever, observed politely, noting the unspoken tensions, the undercurrents of envy and rivalry, and the ways in which civility masked deeper impulses. At midday, he returned to room 12, walking slowly around the single pot of violets. The petals, turned inward, seemed innocuous in themselves, yet he could not dismiss the slight scuff on the floor, the faint fingerprint on the pot, or the placement of a small decorative card that had been shifted from its original position. Each detail was trivial in isolation, yet together they suggested that the act was deliberate, if minor, and that the perpetrator was careful, though not perfectly so. He allowed himself a quiet reflection as he considered the personalities involved. Flaxborough, he knew, operated on layers of propriety, social expectation, reputation, and the unspoken agreements that governed behavior. A minor infraction, like the rearrangement of a pot of violets, was often a proxy for more subtle tests of power, preference, or grievance. The inspector suspected that the first obvious suspect, the baker's apprentice, might merely serve as a convenient outlet for communal anxiety. The true motive, he surmised, lay elsewhere, in the careful, polite maneuverings of those who were otherwise respected and trusted. As afternoon progressed, Purbright convened a brief meeting with the key society members under the pretext of reviewing the exhibition schedule. His manner was gentle and deferential, yet his questions were precise, designed to reveal inconsistencies without direct accusation. Would anyone care to recount precisely who had access to room 12 yesterday, and in what order? He asked, voice soft, almost conversational. Each person provided answers, yet subtle contradictions emerged, glances, hesitations, small additions or omissions, forming a delicate lattice of potential evidence. By evening, the town hall emptied once more, leaving the inspector to his thoughts. He reviewed the day's findings in the quiet of his office, the polite denials, the unspoken tensions, the first obvious suspect conveniently placed at the scene but likely innocent, and the growing sense that room 12 had become a mirror reflecting not merely human curiosity, but the delicate hierarchy of Flaxborough itself. He sipped his tea, noting that the day had yielded little in terms of concrete confession, but much in the way of observation and behavioral evidence. The first suspect was convenient, perhaps, but Purbright's intuition told him that the true explanation would be more subtle and far more revealing about the social choreography of a town that valued propriety above all else. In the quiet, fading light, he allowed himself a small, private satisfaction. The puzzle had begun to take shape, not in the obvious disruption of petals, but in the measured, polite, and occasionally evasive responses of those who had access, knowledge, and motive. And as he prepared to leave, he knew that the careful accumulation of these details would, in due course, point unerringly toward the source of the disturbance, even if Flaxborough itself remained blissfully unaware of the drama quietly unfolding beneath its polished veneer. The morning sun crept cautiously through the lace curtains of Flaxborough Town Hall, casting long shadows across polished wooden floors and rows of floral displays that had, for a brief moment, been the focus of the entire town. Inspector Purbright arrived with his usual deliberation, aware that the most revealing moments often came not from grand gestures, but from the smallest, seemingly inconsequential details. The violet in room 12, though restored to its upright posture, still carried an air of quiet defiance, as if the incident itself had imbued it with subtle personality. As he entered the room, Purbright's attention was immediately drawn to a minor but peculiar detail, a small, slightly crumpled ticket stub lying near the threshold. It had evidently slipped from someone's pocket, perhaps during the initial inspection of the exhibits. On its face was the emblem of the Horticultural Society and the date of the exhibition, yet it bore a faint smudge, perhaps ink, perhaps a fingerprint, just enough to suggest human contact. Purbright bent slightly, noting the precise angle of the crease, the direction in which it had been dropped, and the fact that it had been overlooked by every other observer. Curious, he murmured to himself, for in Flaxborough Curiosity was a form of evidence, not the grand sort that required forensics or dramatic confrontation, but the subtle evidence of human carelessness or unacknowledged intent. The inspector proceeded with his customary slow circuit of the hall, observing exhibitors as they prepared for the next day's activities. Mrs. Weatherby fussed over tablecloths and labels, seemingly unaware of the ticket, while Miss Thorne, gloves meticulously worn, adjusted each flower with clinical precision. Each person moved in their familiar rhythms, yet Purbright noted variations, a glance toward room 12 here, a twitch of the lips there, a hand lingering slightly too long on a teacup. Small behaviors, almost imperceptible, yet entirely revealing to the patient eye. He paused in conversation with Mr. Pendlebury, who was meticulously cataloguing seed packets for the summer displays. Pendlebury mentioned, almost casually, that he had seen someone near the committee room the day prior, fiddling with what appeared to be notes or schedules. "I thought little of it at the time," Pendlebury said, eyes narrowing ever so slightly. "It was probably only a matter of curiosity, though I might have noticed a faint ink mark on their hand." Purbright's interest, already piqued by the crumpled ticket, deepened. Ink, fingerprints, and mislaid objects. These were the threads that could quietly reveal intent when combined with observation and the predictable rhythms of Flaxborough society. He allowed Pendlebury to continue, listening without interruption, storing each word and nuance with the care of someone cataloguing a complex pattern of human behavior. By mid-morning, he had also taken the opportunity to review the committee records for the exhibition. Every signature, every initial, every faintly smudged note became a potential clue. He noticed a slight irregularity in the handwriting of one entry, a flourish on the final A of a name that seemed unnecessary and deliberate. It was minor, trivial even, yet in the quiet patience of his mind it suggested a personality attuned to detail, someone for whom small gestures mattered, and someone who might have the inclination to manipulate the environment in subtle ways. Purbright then requested the attendance logs for the hall on the day of the exhibition. Each name was accompanied by the time of arrival and departure, but one entry seemed slightly askew. A Mrs. Elspeth Grindle, who had been recorded as leaving precisely at noon, appeared also in the witness recollections of several exhibitors after 1 o'clock. A minor inconsistency easily dismissed, yet in Purbright's experience, inconsistencies were rarely accidental in a town as orderly as Flaxborough. He paused to observe the interactions of the society members as they prepared tea and rearranged chairs. Small gestures, a sideways glance, a stiffened posture, a momentary hesitation in speech were more revealing than any confession. Mrs. Weatherby, in particular, seemed intent on maintaining control over the narrative, occasionally interjecting with dramatic flourishes that drew attention to her own authority. It was subtle, but her behaviour, when combined with the misaligned ticket stub and the oddity in the logs, suggested that the motives behind Room 12's disruption might be more entwined with social hierarchy than with sheer mischief. Later, Purbright spoke again with Collingwood, who displayed his usual polite detachment, but could not entirely conceal a faint tension as the inspector's questions turned toward access and timing. "I understand your position, Inspector," Collingwood said carefully, "but I assure you I did nothing beyond casual observation. Still, I cannot account for the behaviour of others." His emphasis on others was noteworthy, as it subtly distanced himself from potential involvement while simultaneously hinting at awareness of minor transgressions elsewhere. By afternoon, Purbright had returned to room 12 once more, crouching slightly to examine the floor beneath the table. There, nearly hidden by the shadow of the pot, he found another small detail, a faint scuff distinct from the general wear of the hall, angled in a direction that suggested a deliberate, if hesitant, approach. It was an almost imperceptible irregularity, yet to Purbright it spoke volumes about movement, timing, and intention. As the day wore on, he began to piece together the constellation of minor anomalies: the crumpled ticket stub, the smudged ink, the irregular log entry, and the subtle scuff on the floor. Each alone would have been trivial. Together they suggested that the disruption in room 12 was not accidental, nor the result of careless youth, but the product of deliberate, if understated, human interference. He made a quiet note to observe the same individuals in social settings, knowing that the small inconsistencies in behavior would likely become more pronounced when subjected to casual conversation and the gentle pressures of town gossip. Flaxborough had a way of revealing itself in increments, and Purbright was patient enough to let the town provide the evidence in its own time. By evening, the hall was again silent, save for the faint rustle of leaves outside and the occasional hum of passing traffic. Purbright remained for a few moments longer, allowing his eyes to trace the arrangement of the flowers, the angle of the light on the pot, and the barely noticeable shift of dust along the floorboards. The trivial but odd details, he reflected, were often the truest indicators of motive, for human nature, when observed closely, left its mark even in the most restrained and polite of societies. As he prepared to leave, he permitted himself a small, private satisfaction. The threads were gathering, the patterns becoming clearer, and room 12, silent and unassuming, held within it more revelation than any grand exposition could. In Flaxborough, the smallest irregularities were rarely without significance, and Purbright, with his characteristic patience, would follow them to their quiet, inevitable conclusion. The morning after Purbright's quiet discoveries dawned with a clarity that seemed almost conspiratorial in its precision. Sunlight spilled across Flaxborough's cobbled streets, highlighting the neat facades of shops and the understated elegance of the town hall, yet beneath the calm, the social machinery of the town was already engaged in a slow, deliberate examination of room 12's disturbance. Purbright, as ever, arrived early, not out of urgency, but from the certainty that the first moments of observation often yielded the most telling insights. He began his day by expanding the field of inquiry, seeking to understand not only the actors already implicated, but the broader context of the town's intricate social web. The first to catch his attention was Mrs. Elspeth Grindle, whose presence the previous day had been noted as irregular. Mrs. Grindle, a lady of exacting habits and a taste for private observation, welcomed him into her drawing-room with the polished courtesy typical of Flaxborough's upper echelon. "Inspector," she said, her voice calm but edged with subtle curiosity. "You wished to discuss room 12, I understand?" "I confess I noticed nothing unusual myself, though I did arrive slightly later than the scheduled opening. Perhaps that has bearing on your inquiries." Purbright observed her carefully, noting the precision with which she set down her teacup, the faint crease along the back of her gloves, and the slight, almost imperceptible glance toward a corner of the room. "You arrived later," he murmured, "yet others recall seeing you in the hall at times inconsistent with the log. Might you clarify?" Mrs. Grindle's expression remained composed, though the faintest twitch of her lips suggested a recognition of scrutiny. "I strolled through the hall after lunch, inspecting the arrangements at a leisurely pace," she explained. "I trust that minor deviations are excusable, though I assure you my intentions were purely observational." Purbright made a mental note. Small deviations, like Mrs. Grindle's tardiness, were rarely accidental in a town governed by habit and precision. They could, however, reveal much when combined with other minor anomalies. Next, he spoke with Mr. Henshaw, the proprietor of the town's stationery shop, who had supplied the exhibition's labels and cards. Henshaw, a man of meticulous detail and quiet pride in his craft, mentioned a slight inconsistency in the printed tickets, an ink smudge that had apparently affected only one batch. Purbright's thoughts immediately returned to the crumpled ticket stub found near room 12. "Did you notice any similar discrepancies elsewhere?" he asked, voice calm and courteous. "None, Inspector," Henshaw replied promptly, though his thumb absently brushed at a small mark on his own hand. "Only that single ticket. I would have thought it insignificant, but now, I suppose it warrants attention." The inspector allowed a subtle pause, letting the thought linger before continuing his round of inquiries. He spoke with the custodian, who reported that a few of the committee members had lingered near room 12 longer than expected, ostensibly to admire certain displays. The custodian's recollections were precise, almost pedantic, and yet in them were tiny inconsistencies. A hesitation in naming who had been present at which moment, an occasional shift of the eyes as if weighing the truth against social obligation. By late morning, Purbright had begun to perceive a pattern. The disturbance in room 12, seemingly trivial, intersected with a broader array of minor deviations, small latenesses, whispered observations, overlooked scuffs, and inconsistencies in log entries. Each was a subtle strand of human behavior, easily overlooked by those more concerned with propriety than with fact. He then visited Mrs. Jenkins, a retired governess known for her sharp eyes and penchant for detail, who had arrived at the hall shortly after the initial discovery of the misaligned violets. "Inspector," she said, settling into her familiar chair, "one cannot imagine mischief so deliberate among our otherwise respectable society. Yet I did notice a subtle tension, glances exchanged between members that suggested curiosity, if not outright suspicion." Purbright allowed her to continue, listening not only to her words but to the manner of delivery, noting which phrases she emphasized and which she understated. In a town like Flaxborough, emphasis often revealed more than content, and understatement often concealed motive. The afternoon passed with Purbright visiting Mr. and Mrs. Collins, owners of the local tea shop, whose proximity to the hall had made them inadvertent witnesses to the comings and goings of exhibitors. They mentioned, almost incidentally, that several townsfolk lingered near room 12 during breaks, commenting in hushed tones and exchanging subtle signals that spoke of rivalries, grievances, and minor resentments. By the time the inspector returned to the hall, he had begun to compile a mental map of the town's interpersonal dynamics. It was evident that the first suspect, the baker's apprentice, was a convenient scapegoat for communal anxiety, while the true pattern of behavior suggested an interplay of minor rivalries, small claims to authority, and a polite but deliberate testing of boundaries among those entrusted with social propriety. Purbright observed the room once more, noting the alignment of the violets, the angle of the pot, and the faint scuff on the floor. Each element was insignificant alone, yet together they suggested careful, deliberate action. The town, through its habitual observations and subtle social maneuvers, had provided the evidence of human intention without ever realizing it. As evening approached, he made a final round of interviews, speaking with Miss Thorne and several junior exhibitors whose recollections filled in gaps in timing and sequence. Minor contradictions emerged. Who had entered room 12 first? Which committee member lingered the longest? Whose hands were perhaps less careful than they ought to have been? Purbright stored each observation with meticulous care, understanding that these small variations, when placed side by side, would eventually reveal a coherent narrative. Finally, as dusk fell over Flaxborough, the inspector returned to his office. He reflected on the day's progress, noting that the field of inquiry had expanded considerably. Room 12, the violets, and the minor anomalies were no longer isolated curiosities. They were the center of a subtle network of social interactions, human tendencies, and understated rivalries. Patience, he knew, would eventually illuminate the truth, as the smallest irregularities in behavior often betrayed the most significant motives. In the quiet of his office, Purbright sipped his tea and allowed a faint, private smile. The town's own meticulousness had provided him with a map, if only he could read it carefully enough. The stage was set, the players identified, and the subtle drama quietly unfolded, waiting only for the inspector's deliberate, gentle touch to guide it toward clarity. The morning brought with it a soft drizzle, blurring the neat lines of Flaxborough's cobbled streets and lending an almost conspiratorial hush to the town. Even the usually brisk movement of shopkeepers and market vendors seemed subdued, as though the weather itself conspired to encourage reflection on Room 12's peculiar disturbance. Inspector Purbright, arriving at the hall, felt a quiet satisfaction in the calm. The town, in its understated rhythm, provided him ample time to consider the threads of behavior he had been cataloguing. His satisfaction, however, was short-lived. Upon entering the hall, he noticed immediately that another small anomaly had occurred. One of the newly arranged displays had been slightly disrupted. A set of dahlias in room 8 were tilted as if brushed aside, and a delicate note card lay inverted on the floor. It was far less dramatic than the previous day's incident with the violets, yet the precision suggested deliberate action, not careless, but intentional, executed with subtlety and a measure of caution. Purbright's eyes swept the room, noting the faint scuff on the polished wooden floor and the direction from which the card had been moved. No footprints, no overt signs of struggle, just the subtle trace of human interference. He allowed himself a quiet reflection. The town, previously united in curiosity about a minor mischief, now faced a second incident which complicated the narrative and rendered the first suspect less plausible as the sole actor. Word of the second occurrence travelled quickly, though never loudly. Mrs. Weatherby, as always, took care to phrase her account with dramatic prudence, remarking that it would appear that the town's floral exhibits are under some curious influence, a statement that invited concern while preserving her own authority. Exhibitors murmured and exchanged glances, their polite facades masking mild consternation. A few wondered aloud if there was now a mischievous pattern, a subtle campaign of disruption, though no one dared suggest deliberate malice among their peers outright. Purbright began his inquiries quietly, seeking to reconstruct the day's movements. He first spoke with Miss Thorne, who appeared slightly frazzled, though determined to maintain decorum. "Inspector," she said, "I cannot imagine who might be responsible. The dahlias were perfectly aligned last evening. This morning they were disturbed, but there is no sign of forced entry, nor any indication of haste." "Were the exhibits observed overnight?" Purbright asked, voice calm and measured, as he crouched to inspect the angles of the dahlias. "Only by the custodians," she replied. "No one else had reason to enter, and they are trustworthy, at least one hopes." She glanced at him with a faint, knowing unease, the unspoken implication clear. Suspicion was now inevitable. The inspector noted her choice of words. "One hopes," a phrase both polite and cautious, reflecting the delicate social choreography of the town. He filed it carefully alongside the crumpled ticket stub, the scuff marks and the irregular log entries from Room 12. Patterns were emerging, but the second incident introduced a complexity that demanded patience and observation. He next consulted with Mr. Pendlebury, who had remained quietly meticulous about records and procedural details. Pendlebury reported that several committee members had remained in proximity to Room 8 the previous evening, ostensibly preparing for the following day's events. Yet his recollection contained slight inconsistencies, such as vague timings and uncertain sequences which, to the inspector's practised eye, suggested human error or human concealment. By mid-morning, Purbright had also gathered the brief accounts of Mrs. Jenkins and Mr. Bartram. Both noted subtle deviations from expected behaviour, hushed conversations, nervous glances and small hesitations when questioned about their movements. In isolation, these observations were minor. Together they hinted at the same delicate undercurrent of disruption that had affected room 12, extending now to other spaces in the hall. While walking between rooms, the inspector observed two new participants who had not previously factored prominently in his inquiries. Miss Harriet Smallwood, a local librarian known for her precise memory and gentle curiosity, had noticed a faint movement near room 8's entrance, though she could not identify the actor. She described a subtle rustling, the shifting of a card, and a slight change in the arrangement of a display, all minor yet consistent with deliberate interference. The other, Mr. Tilling, a retired solicitor with an eye for procedural correctness, offered that he had observed a figure moving between rooms 7 and 8 at a time inconsistent with the official schedule. His account, delivered with measured civility, included careful qualifications. He was not accusing anyone but merely reporting what he had observed. Purbright filed this with interest. The pattern was widening, and the human dimension, decisive in its subtlety, was growing clearer. By afternoon the hall was abuzz with polite conjecture, subdued yet persistent. Conversations turned to hypothetical motives, rivalry among exhibitors, subtle tests of vigilance, or the quiet assertion of authority over the arrangement of displays. Purbright, observing discreetly from a corner, noted the pattern of glances and the timing of whispered remarks. Certain individuals appeared unusually attentive to the disrupted displays, while others, curiously detached, offered almost imperceptible smiles, as though privy to information yet to be articulated. Returning to room 8, he crouched once more to examine the arrangement of dahlias. The tilt was minimal, yet precise. The card had been deliberately inverted, facing away from view. There was no evidence of haste, no accidental disturbance. The act had been calculated, methodical and polite. A quiet challenge, one might say, to the town's collective decorum. Purbright allowed himself a private reflection. The first incident had cast suspicion on a convenient figure. The baker's apprentice had provided a neat outlet for anxiety. Yet the second incident suggested a broader scope, someone more knowledgeable, more deliberate, and possibly with a subtle agenda concerning the exhibition and its social hierarchy. He began to consider the overlaps of opportunity and personality, noting the interweaving of minor resentments, social ambitions, and the human proclivity for asserting control in small, almost invisible ways. As evening approached, Purbright summarized the day's observations in his office. The field had expanded, more participants, more anomalies, and a pattern that was now clearly deliberate rather than accidental. He allowed himself a quiet satisfaction. The puzzle was growing in complexity, yet every thread, the crumpled ticket, the misaligned petals, the scuffed floorboards, and the inverted card offered clues if observed with care. Outside, Flaxborough settled into the gentle rhythm of dusk. Shop windows glimmered with soft lamplight, and passers-by murmured about the peculiar happenings in the hall, carefully phrasing their conjectures to avoid impropriety. Purbright, with the patience born of experience, knew that the subtle dance of observation and gossip would continue to reveal the underlying truth, as human behavior, once closely attended to, rarely concealed its motives indefinitely. He sipped his tea in quiet reflection, noting that the town itself was now complicit in providing evidence through its routines, its conversations, and its careful attention to decorum. The second incident had shifted the trajectory of the enquiry, and he felt a quiet anticipation for The moment when these scattered, understated clues would converge, revealing the hidden hand behind Room 12's disturbance and its quiet extension to Room 8. That evening, the streets of Flaxborough were quiet, damp from a lingering drizzle that left a reflective sheen on the cobbles. The usual bustle of market chatter had softened to a gentle murmur, leaving the town in an almost contemplative pause. Inspector Purbright sat in his modest office, the soft lamplight casting a warm glow over stacks of notes, attendance logs, and the small collection of trivial objects that had accumulated over the past week: the crumpled ticket stub, the inverted note card, and a few carefully preserved scuff marks. For most, these would have seemed inconsequential, but to Purbright they were fragments of a carefully constructed narrative, a subtle choreography of human behavior waiting to be understood. He leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers, and allowed himself the luxury of private reflection. Human nature, he mused, was rarely as straightforward as it appeared. In a town like Flaxborough, where civility and reputation guided almost every interaction, motives were often concealed beneath layers of politeness, habit, and self-interest. A minor disturbance, such as the rearrangement of violets in Room 12, could ripple outward, revealing rivalries, insecurities, or a quiet assertion of control. It was precisely these ripples that he found most revealing. His thoughts returned first to the crumpled ticket stub. It had seemed trivial at the time, a small oversight, easily overlooked in the general bustle of the exhibition. Yet in isolation it had no meaning, only when placed alongside other minor irregularities, the misaligned petals, the subtle scuff marks, the second incident in Room 8, did it begin to suggest a deliberate sequence of human intervention. Each act, carefully measured, demonstrated both awareness and restraint. Someone who wished to disrupt without causing overt chaos, who sought influence within the delicate social hierarchy of the town. Purbright considered the potential actors. The baker's apprentice remained a convenient scapegoat, though his lack of access and evident deference to authority suggested he was unlikely to be the true culprit. Mrs. Weatherby's dramatic insistence on propriety, Collingwood's careful attention to form, and Mrs. Grindle's measured, almost imperceptible deviations all hinted at subtle motives and understated ambition. In Flaxborough, he reflected, influence was often exercised in whispers and glances rather than in open confrontation. It was the small, imperceptible acts that carried weight. He reviewed the sequence of observations from the day's second incident, noting patterns of movement and behaviour. Miss Harriet Smallwood's description of a faint rustling near Room 8, Mr. Tilling's recollection of someone moving between rooms at irregular times, and the slight inconsistencies in log entries all pointed toward a deliberate actor, careful yet confident in navigating the town's conventions. There was artistry in such subtlety, and Purbright appreciated that the human hand often revealed its presence through restraint rather than force. The inspector's attention drifted to the social context of these disturbances. Flaxborough's residents were polite to a fault, attentive to one another's status, and protective of their own reputations. An infraction, even minor, could serve multiple purposes: a test of vigilance, a quiet demonstration of capability, or a mild assertion of authority. The first incident in Room 12, though outwardly trivial, had sparked speculation, gossip, and the polite construction of suspicion. The second incident confirmed that the disruptions were not random. They were part of a pattern, one that reflected human desires and insecurities rather than mere accident. He allowed himself a wry smile at the thought that in some ways the town's adherence to decorum had provided him with more evidence than any confessions could. Politeness, habit, and careful observation had revealed behaviours, and in Flaxborough, those who attempted to conceal intent often betrayed it in the subtlest ways: the hesitation of a hand, the flicker of a glance, the precise choice of words. These were the markers Purbright relied upon, and they had begun to converge into a discernible pattern. His mind returned to the actors themselves, each framed by their own motivations and limitations. Mrs. Weatherby sought to assert control and maintain her authority. Collingwood balanced curiosity with social ambition. Mrs. Grindle navigated her reputation carefully, measuring every movement. Miss Thorne, conscientious yet anxious, represented the moral and procedural order of the hall. Each individual's actions, consciously or unconsciously, contributed to the subtle disruptions. And yet there remained the question of who had chosen to manipulate the displays so deliberately, with precision and careful timing. Purbright noted that the apparent triviality of the incidents was itself a strategy. Those who operated under the radar, who employed minor gestures instead of grandiose acts, often achieved maximum influence with minimum exposure. This insight reinforced his growing suspicion the perpetrator was unlikely to be impulsive or careless. Instead, they were deliberate, patient, and fully aware of the town's social mechanisms. In essence, the crime, or disruption, was as much about social influence as about mischief. He considered the broader implications for Flaxborough society. The town, in its gentle gossip and habitual scrutiny, had supplied him with the raw material of human behaviour. Observations that might have been dismissed by others were now pieces of a complex puzzle, glances exchanged over tea, minor discrepancies in arrival times, and the slight misalignments of petals and cards. Each detail, insignificant alone, was meaningful when connected with others. The second incident had confirmed this pattern, demonstrating both intent and the presence of a careful hand. By late evening, Purbright had synthesized his reflections into a tentative understanding. The first suspect was unlikely to be solely responsible, and the social context suggested multiple motivations converging in a single actor. The pattern of disruption indicated deliberation, knowledge of the hall's routines, and an awareness of the town's obsession with propriety. In short, the perpetrator was someone who understood Flaxborough intimately, who manipulated appearances with subtlety, and who could rely on the town's own routines to conceal intent. He leaned back in his chair, allowing himself a moment of quiet satisfaction. The threads were coming together, though the final picture remained incomplete. Patience, observation, and the gentle interrogation of human nature through both direct questioning and the attentive study of behaviour would, he knew, ultimately reveal the truth. The town's routines, gossip, and social proprieties were, in effect, cooperating with his inquiry, providing him with the necessary clues without any overt confession. Purbright sipped his tea, letting the warmth settle in, and allowed a faint smile to cross his face. Flaxborough's politeness, its obsession with order, and its subtle social rivalries were all revealing themselves in increments. Tomorrow, he resolved, would require careful testing, deliberate questions, and perhaps a staged observation to unsettle the guilty party. For now, reflection and patience were sufficient. The town itself had supplied him with the map. He only needed to trace the lines. The following morning, Flaxborough woke to a soft, misty haze that clung to the eaves of cottages and the neat facades of shops. The streets seemed quieter than usual, as if the town itself were holding its breath, awaiting some subtle resolution to the incidents that had so gently, yet insistently, disturbed its ordinary order. Inspector Purbright arrived at the town hall with a deliberate pace, aware that the next stage of inquiry required careful orchestration. Observation alone had brought him to a point of partial understanding. Now he needed to introduce a test, a polite but deliberate measure designed to reveal truth through reaction rather than confession. He began with Miss Thorne, whose conscientiousness had made her both witness and inadvertent participant in the unfolding drama. "Miss Thorne," he said, adopting his softest, most conversational tone, "I wonder if you might assist me in reviewing the arrangements, not merely for aesthetics, but for security and sequence. One must ensure that everything aligns with proper protocol." Miss Thorne, eager to maintain order and display competence, agreed at once. Together they walked through the hall, discussing positions, timing, and subtle adjustments. Purbright's questions were casual yet pointed, touching on movements of committee members, the timing of inspections, and the possibility of minor disturbances. He allowed each response to hang in the air, observing tone, hesitation, and the slightest inflections that suggested awareness or concealment. It was while examining room 12 that he introduced the first element of his test. "I noticed," he said gently, "that the note card near the violets yesterday was slightly misplaced. One wonders if such small oversights are more common than we think." His gaze, polite and measured, lingered on Collingwood, who was present ostensibly to oversee the discussion. Collingwood's reaction was subtle but telling. His hand shifted slightly, brushing against the table as though to steady himself, and he cleared his throat before replying, "I cannot imagine how that occurred, Inspector. Surely a minor accident in the course of the exhibition. One hopes there was no harm done." Purbright noted the phrasing. The use of "one hopes" mirrored Mrs. Grindle's earlier comment and suggested a shared awareness of social delicacy. The slight tension in his hands, the careful avoidance of direct eye contact, and the immediate focus on minimizing perceived consequences all hinted at an acute consciousness of the event beyond what mere accident would require. He allowed the conversation to drift, speaking now to Mrs. Weatherby about the exhibition's schedule. "It seems," he said lightly, "that the sequence of visits between rooms is more intricate than one might assume. Even minor deviations could cause confusion or perhaps create opportunities for mischief." Mrs. Weatherby, always eager to assert her authority, responded with mild indignation, emphasizing that all procedures had been scrupulously followed. Yet even as she spoke, Purbright noted the brief flicker of unease in her eyes, the fraction of a second where her hands hesitated before gesturing. It was these almost imperceptible movements that formed the heart of his test, to provoke slight discomfort in those whose consciences, however guarded, were not entirely at ease. Next, he sought input from Miss Harriet Smallwood, whose acute observations had already proven valuable. "Miss Smallwood," he said, "you mentioned yesterday a subtle rustling near room 8. I wonder, could such a minor disturbance be significant, or might it be the result of over-attentive observation?" Her response was careful, but contained a subtle flourish, a faint tightening around her lips that suggested she had noticed more than she initially revealed. She did not confess, but her precision in recounting the timing and direction of the rustling served as both a corroboration of his prior observations and an indirect cue to the potential involvement of others who shared her awareness. By mid-morning, Purbright had extended the test further, orchestrating a casual inspection of the hall, while inviting several committee members to observe him moving objects, small cards, minor adjustments to flower positions, without announcing intent. Each participant was subtly watched for involuntary responses, a shift of weight, a brief glance, a slight tightening of the lips. He recorded these reactions in his mind, recognizing the patterns that pointed toward both awareness and concealment. The most telling moment occurred when he approached Mrs. Grindle, who had been quietly observing from a corner. "I find," he said with gentle civility, "that even minor arrangements can be revealing. A simple change in position may suggest intent, or perhaps merely curiosity. One wonders if some are more attuned to these subtleties than others." Mrs. Grindle's response was almost imperceptibly sharp. Her hands rested momentarily on the back of a chair, and her gaze flicked toward the scuff near room 12, a faint recognition crossing her otherwise composed expression. She nodded politely, speaking carefully, but the subtle tension betrayed an internal acknowledgement of significance. Purbright filed this observation alongside Collingwood's earlier reactions and Mrs. Weatherby's slight unease. He allowed the remainder of the morning to unfold in this manner, guiding minor discussions, introducing casual observations, and watching responses. Each reaction, however slight, was catalogued: the nervous adjustment of a hand, a fleeting glance toward a previously noted object, or the brief hesitation before answering a question. The method was not accusatory, but it was precise. The test relied on human nature itself, its tendency to reveal truth through behavior rather than speech. By the time afternoon arrived, Purbright's quiet test had begun to yield a coherent pattern. Certain individuals displayed subtle signs of awareness, those who had observed the original disturbances closely, those whose attention to decorum and sequence exceeded necessity, and those who had opportunities to manipulate minor elements of the exhibition. None confessed outright, yet the combination of tension, hesitation, and incongruous attention suggested an emerging picture of deliberate, understated intervention. Finally, he convened a brief, informal review with key witnesses presenting minor anomalies casually while emphasizing the town's reliance on careful observation and propriety. The discussion was polite, almost ceremonial, yet each participant's body language betrayed varying degrees of awareness. Purbright's eyes, trained in the art of reading subtle cues, discerned the gaps, the involuntary acknowledgements, and the slight discomfort that marked the guilty party. As evening descended, he retired to his office with a sense of quiet satisfaction. The test, gentle and unobtrusive, had begun to reveal who possessed both opportunity and the deliberate intent necessary to disturb the exhibitions in room 12 and room 8. Patience and careful orchestration, he reflected, were far more effective than confrontation. Flaxborough's own habits of observation, gossip, and polite vigilance had supplied him with the responses needed to confirm suspicions. Sipping his tea, he allowed himself a small smile. The field was now clearly delineated, the patterns of behavior and minor transgressions converging toward a subtle but unmistakable truth. Only a few steps remained before the final reveal, and he felt confident that the town's own civility would serve, once more, as an unwitting ally in the pursuit of clarity. The morning light fell gently across Flaxborough, softening the edges of the town and casting a delicate glow upon the hall where the exhibition had become a stage for subtle intrigue. Inspector Purbright arrived with a calm deliberation, carrying a small folder of his notes and a quiet determination. Today the threads he had been gathering through observation, reflection, and gentle testing would converge into a coherent pattern, revealing the truth behind the disturbances in room 12 and room 8. The hall was prepared for a routine meeting of the Horticultural Society, yet Purbright had arranged matters with quiet precision. Chairs were set in a circle, tables remained in their proper positions, and the floral displays, restored to impeccable order, now seemed almost to await revelation. The participants entered with a mixture of curiosity and polite apprehension, unaware that they themselves would be instrumental in confirming the narrative. Purbright began with a measured address, speaking in his usual calm and courteous tone. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining me this morning. I trust your observations during the exhibition have been as attentive as ever. There are, however, a few peculiarities that merit discussion." His eyes, careful and unobtrusive, scanned the room, resting for just a moment longer on those who had shown subtle signs of discomfort during the prior test. He opened his folder, presenting the crumpled ticket stub, the inverted note card, and photographs of the minor scuff marks. Each of these, he continued, might appear trivial in isolation, A misplaced card, a slight scuff, a minor crease, yet in combination they suggest deliberate action. The question, of course, is who and why. A faint murmur ran through the room, restrained by politeness, yet charged with tension. Mrs. Weatherby's eyes narrowed slightly, and Collingwood's hands, which had remained folded in front of him, shifted almost imperceptibly. Purbright allowed these reactions to settle before proceeding, noting the involuntary responses as additional evidence of awareness. "Let us consider the sequence," he said, turning to a diagram of the hall. On the first day, the arrangement in room 12 was disrupted. The violets were misaligned, and a note card was found crumpled nearby. At the time, a convenient hypothesis might have been carelessness by a junior assistant, yet closer observation revealed inconsistencies, log entries, arrival times, and minor behavioral cues that pointed elsewhere. He paused, allowing the weight of these details to sink in. Subsequently, a similar disruption occurred in room 8, where the dahlias were slightly tilted and another note card inverted. This pattern, subtle yet deliberate, indicated knowledge of the hall, timing, and social habits, a hand guided by awareness rather than impulse. Several heads tilted slightly, as if piecing together fragments that had seemed isolated. Purbright's voice remained steady, almost conversational, but his phrasing was deliberate, ensuring that the inferences were drawn by the participants themselves rather than imposed externally. Through careful observation and a series of polite inquiries, it became clear that opportunity alone does not suffice to explain these occurrences. One requires both intent and knowledge, an understanding of human tendencies, the town's habits, and the social weight of decorum. His gaze rested briefly on Mrs. Grindle. Indeed, it is the small details, the minor deviations from routine, that betray such intent. One cannot underestimate the communicative power of glances, hesitation, or a momentary tension in otherwise impeccable comportment. He allowed another pause, letting the room absorb the implication. Then, with the same gentle precision that had guided his investigation, he addressed the core of the matter. Taking into account all observations, the ticket, the note cards, the scuff marks, the inconsistencies in timing and log entries, and the reactions during my recent review, it becomes apparent that the disruptions were deliberate. They were conducted not in malice, but to test vigilance and assert subtle influence over the exhibition's proceedings. A faint exhalation ran through the room. Collingwood, previously composed, shifted in his seat, and Mrs. Weatherby's hands rested lightly on the table, fingers interlaced. Purbright's tone remained calm, almost conversational. The individual responsible was aware of social hierarchies, of the town's adherence to decorum, and of the careful attention paid by each participant. It was precisely this understanding that allowed the small disturbances to occur, unnoticed by most, yet subtly recognized by those attuned to nuance. He allowed a final pause before completing the exposition. In short, the hand behind room 12 and room 8's peculiarities was guided by a desire to test observation, exercise minor authority, and subtly challenge the complacency of routine. The evidence is behavioral, circumstantial, and consistent rather than overtly incriminating, which is why patience and careful observation were essential. Mrs. Grindle, whose demeanour had been composed throughout, now inclined her head ever so slightly, acknowledging the accuracy of the assessment without words. Collingwood, similarly, offered a small, polite nod, his prior discomfort now reconciled within the framework Purbright had provided. Even Mrs. Weatherby allowed a faint, almost imperceptible relaxation of posture, recognizing the civility with which the conclusion had been presented. Purbright concluded with gentle finality. The town itself has provided the evidence. Politeness, habit, and social vigilance have revealed human behavior with greater clarity than any overt confession could. Our observations, when considered collectively, illuminate the quiet motives behind the minor disruptions. I trust we can now return to our normal proceedings with the satisfaction that order has been restored and that subtle lessons in attention and propriety have been learned. A polite murmur of agreement rippled through the room, each participant aware of the layers of insight contained within the inspector's words. The minor disturbances were resolved, their purpose understood, and the town's collective vigilance subtly reinforced. Purbright, observing with quiet satisfaction, allowed himself a small smile, noting that civility and patience had once again proven sufficient to unravel human intention without confrontation or spectacle. The hall, bathed in the soft light of the afternoon sun, seemed to sigh with relief. The displays were intact, the participants reassured, and the subtle tensions of recent days dissolved into the familiar rhythm of Flaxborough life. Purbright, having quietly guided the truth to the surface, allowed the resolution to settle naturally, knowing that the town would carry its lessons forward with the gentle discretion for which it was known. The morning following the resolution dawned crisp and unremarkable over Flaxborough. Sunlight glimmered on the damp cobbles, and the town seemed to exhale, as if the subtle tension of the past week had finally eased. The exhibition had concluded without incident, the floral displays once again aligned with meticulous precision, and the participants moved through their routines with the calm efficiency for which they were known. Life, as usual in Flaxborough, resumed its gentle cadence. Inspector Purbright arrived at his office, carrying the quiet satisfaction of a case concluded not with confrontation but with careful observation and patient orchestration. The town's social machinery had provided all the evidence he needed: glances, hesitations, minor deviations from routine, and small but deliberate acts of disturbance. Each participant had played their part, knowingly or unknowingly, in revealing human nature through behavior rather than confession. He settled into his chair, reviewing his notes from the past days. The crumpled ticket stub, the misaligned violets, the tilted dahlias, and the inverted note cards had all been accounted for, their purpose understood, and their responsible hand gently acknowledged. Purbright allowed himself a small smile. The town itself, in its attentiveness and adherence to decorum, had essentially testified to the truth without a single word of admission. As he sipped his morning tea, he reflected on the participants. Mrs. Weatherby had returned to overseeing her responsibilities with renewed vigour, her minor discomfort now subsumed into a polite acknowledgement of the lesson implicit in the events. Collingwood maintained his habitual composure, though he now seemed slightly more attentive to subtle shifts in the hall's arrangements. Mrs. Grindle, as ever, moved with measured elegance, but her glances, once fleetingly anxious, now bore the faint trace of recognition, an understanding that even minor acts could resonate far beyond intention. The town's younger residents, who had watched with curiosity from the sidelines, were particularly attentive to the subtle interplay of behavior and consequence. The baker's apprentice, previously the convenient focus of suspicion, returned to his duties with the quiet relief of innocence affirmed, though perhaps a bit wiser to the ways in which the town observed and interpreted actions. Even Miss Smallwood and Mr. Tilling, whose observations had provided crucial context, seemed to carry an unspoken pride in their awareness, though tempered by discretion. Purbright allowed himself a moment to reflect more broadly. Flaxborough, in its insistence on civility, routine, and propriety, had revealed a truth that could never have been extracted through overt interrogation. The town's social fabric, woven from habit, observation, and polite vigilance, had been both the medium and the message. Human behavior, subtle and deliberate, had been illuminated without spectacle, proving once again that patience and careful attention often revealed more than accusation or force. By late morning, Purbright had returned to routine paperwork, a quiet smile still lingering as he methodically recorded the details of the exhibition and the incidents that had transpired. Letters of correspondence, logs, and minor reports filled the desk before him, each item an unassuming record of the town's return to order. The minor disturbances had left no lasting disruption, only subtle adjustments in behavior and awareness. People were more attentive to the arrangement of displays, the timing of entries, and the subtle cues of social interaction. Outside, the streets carried the familiar sounds of life. Shopkeepers arranging wares, children laughing along the cobbled lanes, and the occasional rumble of a cart over uneven stones. The town, resilient in its routines, had absorbed the lessons of the past week without drama. Gossip persisted, of course, as it always did, but tempered now by understanding rather than suspicion. Room 12 and Room 8, once the centers of gentle mystery, now held only the quiet memory of precise disruption and the understated revelation of intent. Purbright reflected on his own role, noting the satisfaction inherent in guiding a resolution that relied on observation, patience, and human subtlety rather than force or confrontation. In Flaxborough, minor irregularities often spoke louder than grand declarations, and civility, when observed carefully, provided a mirror for intention and motive. He appreciated the irony. A seemingly trivial disturbance had revealed more about human nature than any overt scandal might have. As afternoon light shifted across the town, Purbright concluded his notes, closed his folder, and allowed the calm of routine to settle around him. The exhibition was over, the town had resumed its gentle rhythm, and the lessons implicit in minor disruptions had been absorbed with the usual decorum. In Flaxborough, life moved quietly onward, shaped subtly by observation, civility, and the occasional whisper of human ambition or curiosity. He poured a final cup of tea, savouring its warmth, and watched the soft movements of the town through his office window. Small, deliberate actions, the smallest of gestures, had reshaped the understanding of those involved, reinforcing vigilance, propriety, and a deeper awareness of human nuance. The town had been both stage and participant, and in its cooperation, the subtle mystery had been resolved. As dusk approached, the hall lay empty, the displays perfectly aligned, the minor traces of disturbance carefully restored to order. The day ended as all days in Flaxborough tended to end, with calm, with civility, and with a quiet acknowledgement of human nature in its most understated forms. Purbright returned to his desk, closing his notebook and allowing the town's subtle rhythm to carry on uninterrupted.